Ukraine is back in the language of trade. Not because the war is over, not because the front lines have frozen into a stable peace, but because, in the middle of missiles, blackouts, and political fatigue, Kyiv is quietly stitching itself back into the global economy. While Russian troops push in the east and drones still hit Ukrainian cities, Volodymyr Zelensky is flying from capital to capital, signing billion-dollar energy contracts, negotiating fighter jet deals, and now sitting down in Turkey with a Trump envoy to talk about peace. Let's start with that image. Ankara. On one side, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the man who already played mediator in the Black Sea grain deal. On the other, Volodymyr Zelensky, representing a country exhausted by nearly 3 years of full-scale war. And now, at the table, Steve Witkoff, a businessman and Donald Trump's designated peace envoy, coming to join talks that Zelensky says are meant to intensify negotiations and bring the end of the war closer. Zelensky insists his priority is a just peace for Ukraine, but the reality around that table is brutally simple. Behind every word like peace, security, or sovereignty, there's another word hiding in the shadows: trade. Who controls which pipelines? Who sells which weapons? Who rebuilds which cities? According to reports, a U.S.-drafted peace proposal circulating in the background calls on Ukraine to give up some territory and even part of its weaponry in exchange for a ceasefire. In other words, peace in return for concessions. Russia, for now, isn't even at the table. The Kremlin has said there are no plans for Russian representatives to join the talks in Turkey, so these meetings are less about signing a final deal tomorrow and more about shaping the framework, the narrative, and the balance of power when that day finally comes. Turkey wants to show it's still a central broker between East and West. Trump's circle wants to show it has its own channel and its own plan. Ukraine wants one thing above all: to not be treated like a piece on someone else's chessboard. But while the cameras are focused on Ankara and the word peace, something just as important is happening a few hundred kilometers away on the Greek coast. There, in ports like Rafale and the new LNG terminals, American liquefied natural gas is arriving, being regasified and pushed into the pipelines that lead north, straight toward Ukraine. Zelensky has just sealed a deal with Greece to secure U.S.-origin LNG deliveries for Ukraine from December 2025 to March 2026, the critical winter months when Russia traditionally used energy as a weapon. This is not just a commercial contract, it's a geopolitical statement. For decades, Ukraine's role in the gas story was simple. It was the transit corridor for Russian gas heading to Europe. Moscow turned the tap on or off to send political messages. Now, the map is being flipped. LNG tankers leave U.S. terminals, reach Greece, go through European infrastructure, and end up heating homes and powering factories in Ukraine. That's Ukraine back in the global trade system, but on completely new terms. The first sign of this shift came earlier, when Ukraine's private energy firm deescalation received a first cargo of U.S. liquefied natural gas via Greece, about 100 million cubic meters of gas equivalent. At the time, officials in Kyiv called it a strategic step, a victory on the energy front after months of Russian strikes on power plants and the grid. Now, with this new multi-month agreement, that step turns into a corridor. Greece positions itself as a key LNG hub for southeastern Europe, while Ukraine reduces its vulnerability to Russian transit routes and to the constant threat of energy blackmail. Think about what that means. The war continues, but the energy flows are being rewired. New contracts, new routes, new dependencies. European companies, American exporters, Greek terminal operators, Ukrainian utilities. All of them are signing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And behind every one of those contracts, there is a political message. Ukraine is not an isolated battlefield. It is a future market that investors expect to survive and rebuild. Now, add a second massive flow of money and technology: weapons. While Zelensky is discussing peace in Turkey and energy in Greece, in France, he has just signed one of the most ambitious defense agreements of the war so far, a plan for Ukraine to acquire up to 100 Rafale F-4 fighter jets over the next decade, plus advanced air defense systems, drones, and precision munitions. The deal is framed as historic by both Zelensky and Emmanuel Macron, and it is. We're talking about tens of billions of euros over time, potentially funded in part by EU mechanisms and even by frozen Russian assets. if European governments finally unlock that option. On paper, these Rafale jets won't arrive overnight. Training pilots, building maintenance infrastructure, and integrating the aircraft into Ukraine's air force will take years. But the political signal is immediate. First came promises of Soviet-era MiGs, then F-16s, then Mirage 2000s. Now, Europe's top multi-role combat aircraft. This is Ukraine betting on a long war and reconstruction cycle, where it becomes a permanent, heavily armed frontline state anchored in Western defense supply chains. For France and its defense industry, it's also a huge commercial win. Dassault's shares have already jumped on news of the deal, as investors see years of guaranteed orders and maintenance contracts. So when we say Ukraine is back to trade, we're not only talking about grain ships in the Black Sea or steel exports. We're talking about 3 layers of trade unfolding at the same time. First, the trade in energy, U.S. LNG through Greece, new gas corridors, contracts designed to protect Ukraine from blackouts, and Russia's pressure during difficult winters. Second, the trade in weapons, Rafales, SAM-T air defense batteries, drones, ammunition, pilot training programs, all of it forming a long-term, high-tech supply chain. And third, the trade in influence. Who mediates? Who drafts the peace proposals? Who gets to say what a just peace actually looks like? Turkey, by hosting these talks with a Trump envoy at the table, is positioning itself not just as a diplomatic player, but as a gatekeeper to future reconstruction contracts and transport corridors. If a ceasefire or framework agreement is ever signed on Turkish soil, Ankara will be able to say, "We opened the door," and that matters later when billions in reconstruction money start to flow. The Trump camp, by sending Witkoff, signals that even outside the White House, it wants a piece of the solution story, a narrative where a Trump-backed plan ended the war, which can be used politically and economically later. Meanwhile, on the ground, nothing is simple. Russian forces are still pressing around key cities like Pokrovsk in the Donbas, trying to turn battlefield pressure into negotiating leverage. Ukrainian cities like Odessa continue to suffer from drone and missile attacks targeting ports and energy facilities, the same infrastructure that Ukraine needs to export grain and import fuel. Inside Ukraine, there are corruption scandals in the energy sector, political struggles, and public debates about how much compromise is acceptable after so many sacrifices. So here's the paradox you need to keep in mind as you watch these headlines. On one side, images of destruction, trenches, casualties, and a front line that moves only a few kilometers after months of fighting. On the other, announcements of LNG contracts for the winter of 2026, fighter jets that will arrive in 5 or 10 years, and peace talks that involve businessmen, presidents, and envoys more than soldiers. Ukraine is living in 2 time frames at once: the brutal present of war and the strategic future of trade. For some, all this looks like hope: energy security deals, modern air defenses, long-term partnerships with Europe, and a possible diplomatic track in Turkey, signs that the international community has not abandoned Ukraine and that the country has a place in tomorrow's economic map. For others, it looks like a trap: peace plans that may push Kyiv to accept territorial losses, reconstruction tied to foreign capital and interests, a military and energy model that could leave Ukraine permanently dependent on Western suppliers. The key questions are simple but uncomfortable. When Zelensky shakes hands in Ankara, who is really setting the terms? Ukraine? Or those supplying the gas and the jets? When Ukraine signs for U.S. LNG via Greece, is it gaining energy independence or just changing the flag on the pipeline? When it orders Rafales and SAM-T systems, is it buying security or locking itself into a war economy for decades? What we can say for sure is this: Ukraine is no longer just the battlefield. It's becoming a central node in a new network of trade, energy, and security stretching from Washington to Athens, from Paris to Ankara. Talks about peace are happening at the same time as contracts about gas and jets, and none of these are separate. The future map of Ukraine, its borders, its infrastructure, its alliances, is being drawn right now through both diplomacy and deals. And this is where I want to leave the question with you. Is Ukraine back to trade the beginning of its recovery and integration into a safer, more independent future? Or is it the next phase of a geopolitical game where every pipeline and every fighter jet comes with a price that will only become clear after the guns fall silent? Tell me what you think in the comments. Is this the path to a just peace, or just a new kind of dependency dressed up as partnership?